What's up, YouTube? Rob back again with another edition of Rob's Picks. And this week I'm going to talk about X-Men Gold #1. So this is a book that I've been eagerly awaiting ever since its announcement. A lot of you probably don't know this, and I mean all of you probably don't know this, but the X-Men are what got me into comic books to begin with. I mean, as many people in their mid to late 20s, I fell in love with the X-Men during the 90s with the relaunch of X-Men with the X-Men standalone title, as well as the 90s X-Men cartoon. And just the 90s was a glorious time to be an X-Men fan. And since then, I've gone back, I've read all the stuff from the 60s onward. I love Claremont stuff in the 70s and 80s. I love the mid-80s split with X-Factor and the X-Men. There's something about that era when half of the X-Men were Australia doing weird stuff with the Brood. I love the X-Men. And I've kind of fallen out of love over the past decade. There have been ups and downs. I think there's been some really, really good X-Men stuff in the past 10 years. I think Jason Aaron's Wolverine and the X-Men was great. I think the start of Bendis's run with the younger X-Men was great. But all in all, I would say the majority of X-Men books have just not really done it for me. So when I heard the news last year that Marvel was going to launch 2 X-Men books to kind of be the flagship X titles with X-Men Blue and X-Men Gold, I was super excited because you had the X-Men Gold team that was similar to the mid-80s X-Men team with Kitty Pryde, Wolverine, Colossus, and Storm. And then on the other side, you kind of had the original X-Men team with X-Men Blue, where you had like Jean Grey, Cyclops, Iceman, and Beast. And that is exactly what I want. I want the core X-Men. I want just 2 books. I don't want 100 books. I want just quality. So this week we had the launch of X-Men Gold #1. Now I'm going to start by saying I didn't love this book. I didn't hate this book, but I didn't love it. It felt very slight. And I'm not sure if I still understand the voices of all the X-Men characters. It's been a very long time since I've really followed these characters. So when there's all that mention of the X-Men versus the Inhumans war, and I feel like there's just a lot of drama and gossip and backstory that I've kind of missed out on over the past decade. Now, this is not a slight against the book. That is more on my end for not being such a dedicated X-Men reader like I was in the past. But I do wish that this was even more of a clean slate than it is. There are some great things. I think there are some good character moments. I do love any time that Kitty and Colossus kind of have a little back and forth. I've always liked their relationship together. And one of my favorite things about the X-Men is kind of the romantic relationships between some of the characters. And anytime stuff like that takes the forefront, I'm into it. And for anybody who read the abysmal exposition-filled waste of $5 known as X-Men Prime, you know that Marvel has basically moved the headquarters of the X-Men into the middle of Central Park instead of in Limbo anymore, which I think is a good move because the X-Men are once again in the forefront of the world. They are dealing with real-world situations. They don't have to kind of leave Limbo and be this other even more than they already are. So a lot of times in superhero comic books, you kind of just see them set up base wherever they want, where it's Superman's Fortress of Solitude up in Antarctica, or the original X-Men in Westchester, New York, upstate New York somewhere. You've got the Fantastic Four who just own a building, the Avengers that just own a building and or a mansion, and they kind of just exist in the world, not necessarily in a place that us as actual human beings can relate to. But in X-Men Gold #1, you get to kind of see the bureaucratic downside to just popping up a brand new mansion in the middle of Central Park. And there's a great scene where everybody's kind of playing softball like the X-Men always do. There's always playing softball for some reason. And basically someone who works for the mayor comes by and he's like, "Hey everybody, we're super pumped to have the X-Men in Central Park, but I'm gonna need you to fill out some of this paperwork, and here's your lease, and here's your property taxes, and here is a bunch of other bureaucratic paperwork that the X-Men need to fill out." And it basically accounts to $18 million a month for the X-Men to keep their mansion there, which I just think is kind of a funny, like, wink and a nod towards like the ridiculousness of a lot of these X-Men and just superhero comics in general, because you can't just pop up in the middle of Central Park and not pay for it. Like, it's kind of ridiculous, and I kind of like that they're drawing attention to this and kind of adding just a very low level of drama, where now we have Kitty Pryde, who's the new leader of the X-Men, who has to deal with all this logistical and bureaucratic and just financial woes, as well as fight the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, who show up at the end to kind of be the bad guys for the beginning of this series. And overall, I'm interested, and I'm going to keep reading, and I hope that this book can kind of recapture some of that fun that the X-Men comics used to have back in the 80s and 90s. And I love this team. I love Wolverine, Nightcrawler, Kitty, Rachel Gray, Storm. I think that's a good team, a good lineup. And I'm looking forward to seeing how this book wraps up. And that light is dying. Well, hey, I hope you liked what you heard and watched. If you're interested in more content from us, check out Paul's videos as well as our podcast that we do weekly. And yeah, thanks for sticking around and checking out Kronos' Speakeasy's content.